Hello there, welcome everyone. Tonight we're going to talk about harvest decisions for the VIDI 308 Fruit to Wine Enology class with yours truly. So the big question circling around this presentation is when to harvest depending on what type of wine you want to make, right? So different styles of wine are picked at different times because the chemistry gives way to that style that you're looking for, right? So sparkling wine, port style wines, various forms of German sweet wines, ice wine, these all require very specific conditions and timing to harvest to make these styles of wine. So for the winemaker's perspective, we want to harvest at that ideal time for that wine style. The flavor of that wine is very largely dictated by the fruit composition at harvest. The goal is to have ideal composition at the time of harvest for that specific style, right? So a little repetitive, but still good information. So just as a recap, this is our berry ripening curve. As you can see, there are 3 stages for berry ripening. You have stage 1, 2, and 3. As you can see in stage 1, we have acids, this blue line, organic acids, accumulating very, very quickly, and then peaking at stage 2. At stage 3, it starts to drop. On the red line, we have sugar accumulation, which you can see there's no sugar in stage 1 and 2. It starts to accumulate in stage 3 at the onset of what's called veraison. And these berries are symbolic of what the berries on the grape cluster would look like as it develops and ripens at the stages as well. So in stage 1, you see it's very, very small. It starts to get larger. Stage 2, it reaches half its final size. Stage 3, it starts to swell with water and sugar. And then veraison is when the berries start to soften and they start to develop colors in their skins. So for a red grape variety, they'll start to turn purple. For a white grape variety, they'll start to become less green and more kind of like whitish looking, right? But they'll soften up just the same. So we'll just give you like a written demonstration of exactly what's happening at each stage for your study purposes. So stage 1 is berry formation to lag phase. So the berry has formed, cells are beginning to divide in the berry, acids and tannins develop in the grape skins and pulp during the stage, right? And if you ever been to if you ever grown fruit or been to like an apple farm, if you tried to eat the fruit before it's ready, it's like really acidic and really harsh, right? So this makes sense, right? Stage 2 is lag phase to veraison. This is when berries reach half their final size. So just to recap, berries reach half their final size in stage 2. Cell division stops, but they start to enlarge, right? So this is when they start to accumulate water and just grow in size in general, but they're not dividing cells, right? Seed embryos also begin to form and grow at this point. There's more acid and tannin accumulating, but this is the peak content the berry will ever have before veraison, right? And then it starts to lower. Stage 3 is marked right at veraison. So if we look at our picture here, stage 3 is marked right as the berry starts changing color. Once we see this, acids start becoming metabolized by the fruit, by the grapes, and then sugars start to accumulate. And this is the final stage of ripening. So this is when, of course, berries change color, soften, accumulate sugars, and metabolize acids. And if you'd like to read some more, I do have an article linked here for you to check out. Okay, so let's get into specifically harvest times for different styles of wine, right? Assuming at this point we kind of have a general baseline for still white wines and reds, right? So for white wines, they're typically harvested before red varieties, right? Red table wines. A white grape variety, you could harvest around 22 bricks, right? And a red grape variety, you could easily harvest around 25, 26 bricks, right? Those are the stereotypical ranges for that, but we're going to focus on kind of the more unique styles that you may not have heard of before. So, for example, sparkling wine. Sparkling wine is typically harvested slightly unripe to keep the fresh acidity in the wine. So this is one of the first things to harvest. Typically, if you work in sparkling wine, your harvest is over much sooner than everyone else because you just started earlier in the game, right? What makes this wine fizzy is the carbon dioxide that's produced in the bottle, right? So the traditional method and the ancestral method calls for the fermentation to happen inside the bottle. As you can see here, there's some yeast on the edge of this bottle that's actively fermenting. It's building pressure. It's releasing carbon dioxide in the bottle. It's a very calculated amount to produce the specific atmospheres of pressure required to make a good sparkling wine, right? However, carbon dioxide can also be bubbled in directly. That's known as the Charmat method. So that's when you have a pressurized tank, very large tank, that you sparkle CO2 into, and then you bottle it from there, right? So it can be made in 3 different ways. We'll talk about this more in the winemaking presentation next lecture. So those 3 ways are ancestral method, traditional method, also known as method champenoise, and then the tank method, which is referred to as the Charmat process. But we'll get more into that in the winemaking lecture. Okay, late harvest wines, on the other hand, are harvested much, much later than sparkling wines, right? So you kind of have 2 extremes on the scale, right? Sparkling wine is harvested very, very early. Late harvested wines, just as the name implies, are harvested very late. At this point, they're harvested so late that the grapes start to raisin, they dehydrate, and therefore the sugar content is very, very high, right? Wines that are late harvest are not necessarily fortified and therefore do not necessarily have a higher alcohol. It's totally normal to have a late harvest wine that's extremely sweet and that's only around 6% alcohol, right? And how they did that was they harvested very late, they partially fermented that juice, and then they arrested the fermentation, right? You can do that by temperature, like bringing the tank down to very, very cold temperatures, sterile filtering, so you remove all the yeast and bacteria in solution, bottle, and sulfur dioxide helps, of course, as well. So that'd be the way to keep it sweet and to keep it from re-fermenting in the bottle later, right? Typical varieties for late harvest wines are Pinot Gris, Viognier, Muscat of Alexandria, and much, much more, right? It doesn't have to be white varieties. It could also be red wines as well. Could be late harvest. On the other hand, we have another kind of style of late harvest, which we refer to as port-style wines. We can't make port in the United States because that is a protected designation from Portugal, but we can say it was made in the port style. We are allowed to say that. So these, as just like the late harvest, are harvested very late to attain the highest amount of sugars. In this situation, to keep the sweetness in the wine, you would arrest the wine partway through the fermentation, but you would do that with spirits. So typically brandy or a wine spirit of some kind, and that process is called fortification. So you fortify the fermenting must to stop the fermentation. Why does that work? Once we get above 15% textbook wise, but in reality you're like close to 18 to 20% alcohol in your solution, no yeast or bacteria can thrive in that environment, and therefore you don't have to worry about re-fermentation of that residual sugar that's left behind, right? So that is how a port style wine is made. That is the traditional method in Portugal, right? Okay, in addition, there's another type of late harvest wine, and these are called botrytized wines. These are really interesting because they utilize a fungus called Botrytis cinerea, and it's also known as noble rot, right? So this is something that forms on the grape clusters naturally under very damp, humid conditions. This kind of mold / fungus will actually form on the grape clusters, and it will concentrate the sugar flavors on its own as it attacks the fruit. And this will transform the flavors into very honey and beeswax kind of flavors. It's very, very popular in Germany, France, and Hungary. I have a couple articles, an article and a video for you guys if you'd like to learn more. Overall, they make very good wines, very expensive, high quality. It takes a lot of labor to go through and harvest these grapes. And then there's also a lot of monitoring because you have a goal for the percentage of rot in your clusters for your fermentation, right? So you don't want it to be 100%. Maybe you want it to just be 20% of the cluster. So there's a lot of work going through and actually cutting out excess rot, so that way you can control the flavors that come through in your wine product. So That is another way to do it. Wines that are made with botrytis infected grapes. Lots of them, actually, surprisingly. We have Tokay wines, which is originated from Hungary. We also have Sauternes in France. And then in Germany, we have a special designation for these really, really sweet wines. It's the sweetest wine that they make, and it's Trockenbier and Auslese. So very cool to see that different parts of the world utilize this mold to produce very sweet wines. We do have some information for that for you if you'd like. So this Tokaji wine, that's like the region, and a little YouTube video for you as well, if you'd like to see. Okay, another form of late harvest. That's not just harvesting late, fortifying with brandy, or utilizing botrytis. And this is one that's very near and dear to me, and this is called ice wines. Originated from Germany. Germany made ice wine very popular, and this is a wine that can only be created if you live in an area that you're able to leave the grapes on the vine long enough to a season where it actually freezes. The water inside the solution of the berry matrix will freeze first before the sucrose solution does. So just that act itself will concentrate the sugar solution left behind, right? So for example, if you ever left a carton of non-fat milk in a freezer, there's so much water and non-fat milk that it'll actually form a huge brick of ice in the gallon, and then you'd be left with the matrix of like everything that's left outside of that, right? So similar process, right? So to do this correctly, you have to harvest the grapes frozen, which means you have to harvest it in the middle of the night. So it's a lot of work, a lot of labor, very difficult and very uncomfortable for a lot of people who do this. Once you bring in the grapes frozen, you have to put it in the press right away before the ice melts. And then you press very hard, the ice is left behind, and then all of the sucrose solution comes through and gets pumped into a tank, and then it gets partially fermented. And it stays as a very sweet wine, and it comes in these very small, skinny bottles. They often look like this, very tall and skinny. And they're typically expensive because it's a very expensive process to make. Okay, so those are some of the like more bizarre harvesting methods for the different styles of winemaking. Another thing that I want to talk to you guys about is the concept of the sliding scale of berry ripening flavors. And this is a scale that was created by Linda Besson when she did research in 2001 on the evolution of flavors in Cabernet Sauvignon. And the big takeaway was for any variety of grape, there is an evolution of flavors depending on what time you harvest the grapes. So here's an example for Cab Sauv specifically, right? And it generally works its way towards vegetation, which tastes like plant matter, to herbaceousness, unripe fruit, red fruit, black fruit, and then jam. So if you think about this on the scale of Brix and how the grapes ripen throughout the season, right? So say this is Cabernet Sauvignon. Let's say that the ideal time to harvest is 24 and a half Brix. Let's just say theoretically, right? So what this would mean that at 24 and a half Brix, you would have this red fruit category, right? This is the typical time people want to pick. If you were to go backwards to say 22 Brix, when you would typically harvest a white wine, right? You'd get unripe fruit, but it would be green apple, citrus rind, right? It's going to be tart, there's going to be more acid, but less sugar, and these would be the characteristics you would get from it. If you harvest it even before that, say at like 18 Brix, right? It's going to be very herbaceous. There's not going to be really any fruit component to this at all. You're going to have like straw, herb, vegetal components, and then maybe even like tobacco, right? So not necessarily completely pleasant and definitely not expected for wine. If you harvest even before that, say like 10 Brix, for example, you don't really have a lot to work with, and your fruit is still very, very green at this point. So your wine is just going to taste like plant matter at this point, right? So then fast forward back to 24 and a half, right? So you have some red fruit characters, If you let the fruit sit on the vine longer, say 27, 28 bricks, those flavors will evolve this way. So you'll get like black fruit, plum, blackberry, black cherry. These are all components of black fruit that you would get in the wine. Then say you leave the fruit on the vine even longer. Say somehow you're able to get it up to 32 bricks, right? And it starts to dehydrate, it starts to raisin, right? Maybe even turn a little bit brown. If you made wine from that, those flavors would be very jam-like, right? So like cooked fruits, prune, dates, and raisins would be the characteristics that you get. So for example, if you ever had a Zinfandel from Lodi that tastes like raisins, typically it's because it was harvested very, very late, right? So, and not only Lodi is capable of making that, you can get a raisin-like Zinfandel from a lot of places, but just a good example of how that evolution changes depending on when you pick it, right? So a real life example, Cabernet Sauvignon, right? Cabernet Sauvignon typically has a green bell pepper component. This tends to be more expressed the earlier you pick it, right? Which makes sense with this chart. The earlier you pick, the more vegetation you're going to get. The later you pick, the less vegetation you're going to get in the characteristics of that wine. So I have met winemakers who wait to pick their cab and even like Syrah until they get to at least 26 to 28 bricks. Then they'll water back because they don't want any of those vegetal characteristics in that specific wine. So they are picking at a specific time deliberately to manipulate the flavors expressed in their final product. Okay, here's a really good picture of that same concept, right? So here we have time on the x-axis. On the wine, we have sugar per berry. As you can see, as the sugar accumulates, right, we get towards these scales of flavor as it evolves, right? So in the very beginning, we get kind of mineral and resinous, green fruit, fresh fruit. Then it starts to evolve more towards, red fruit. Then we have, once you like kind of pass, this is the window, this white little column here, the window of when it would be best to pick, right? The normal range. So you would have anywhere from fresh fruit to dried fruit in this section, right? And ripe being in the center. Then as you wait to pick and you're kind of past that normal window, that's when you start to get like candied fruit, jam, and then eventually boiled fruit, right? And then roasted nutty, and then even meaty characteristics, which doesn't sound very good, right? The color on the scale also kind of reflects the color of what the grape would be at that stage, right? So say this is a red grape variety, so it starts off very green. During veraison, it evolves to red. Then there's this red period, and then it starts to kind of become oxidized. It starts to turn brown, it's kind of falling apart, and then it's just not very good anymore. So a good example visually of what's happening in the fruit itself. Another thing to consider in winemaking is that if you choose to ferment whole cluster and you keep the stems on the fruit, there's actually characteristics you can gain from the stems themselves, right? So if you have green stems and the status is this is an unripe cluster, it's going to contribute vegetal and leafy characteristics to your wine. If the stems are brown, that means that they're considered ripe, right? And they start to turn from green to brown. Then you'll get some interesting characteristics like resinous wood, spice, cloves, cinnamon, and even pepper. So we never really think about stems contributing flavor or using it as a way to express our wines, but this is a fun way to consider it as well. And then we also have brittle and brown stems. These are considered overripe, but they will contribute dried leaf, tea, and herbal components to your wine if you choose to use them. Cool. So when to harvest, right? The big takeaway, when the berry composition is just right, that is the most ideal time to harvest, right? Some people will just rely on their tastes when the berry tastes right, but there's also a lot of non-berry factors going on. Like, unfortunately, we do not live in an ideal world. It's hardly ever the ideal situation. During harvest, it's very chaotic, right? So like non-berry factors would be, is it going to rain? Do I have labor available to help me pick this fruit? Do I have enough space to accommodate this fruit as it's coming in, right? So most wineries do not have the volume or the ability, the empty tanks available to take on all the fruit at once. We often rely on fruit maturing at different times, so that way we can cycle through the tanks, right? We never have enough space to take everything at once. So like first we'll bring in the white varieties, we'll process them, they go into tanks, then we'll bring in some of the early reds, right? We'll process them, they'll go into tanks. As we keep going, some of those reds specifically will be ready to press and move to a closed type tank or different storage type of tank or barrel even, right? So you are constantly pressing, emptying tanks, and then refilling them to use them again for the next lot that's coming in. So there's definitely a metric behind this, right? There's like an engineering space component that we have to consider as well. Cool. Here's just a couple pictures of, some factors too, like berries can be sunburnt over time, like can be really severe, right? So if you see this kind of blush color on white grape varieties, and then you can see some severe sunburn. Here at B, C, we have a healthy Barbera cluster on the left, and on the right, this is a sunburn cluster with poor coloration and raisoning as well. So things can look like that too. Okay, so one, to determine it's time to pick, you should sample your berries and measure your progress, right? So it's very important. This can help you develop an idea, like to forecast when to pick, depending on the trend, right? So for this, you would go into the vineyard with a Ziploc and pick random berries to obtain the most accurate samples for analysis. Other forms of berry sampling would include taking the entire cluster, so whole cluster sampling, going through and taking whole clusters off of like random vines, or picking all the clusters off of one vine, which I haven't met anyone that does that process, but the thought behind it is there's going to be so much variation just in one vine, it should represent what all the vines are going through, which is not necessarily true, so I actually would not recommend that, even though it's in the textbook. Okay, each vine and location will have variation in sugar, acid, and pH, right? So depending if your block that you're looking to pick, if it has like a section that's at the top of the hill versus a section that's at the bottom of the hill, right? These are going to be very different from each other in ripening and development, because the top of the hill will receive more sun throughout the day. The bottom of the hill will be much cooler. All the cold air settles at night. So they're going to have very different chemistry. So it's important that you get the most statistically representative sample that you can from these samples. Okay, the compositional factors that we're looking at before harvest include sugar, also known as Brix, pH, and titratable acidity. For Brix, the sugar content is really important, not just for like that sliding scale of flavors that we talked about, but the sugar content is ultimately going to determine what your alcohol content is going to be in your resulting wine, right? So typically, for wines, 13 to 15% is pretty decent. If you pick your fruit much later and you get an even higher alcohol, you could risk having a stuck fermentation. And when you have a stuck fermentation, it could lead to spoilage in your wines, right? So any sugar left after fermentation is complete is known as residual sugar. And I would argue that that would indicate that the fermentation is not complete, right? Because it's the conversion of sugar to alcohol. If any sugar left, it's not complete, right? A stuck fermentation would classically be when a wine is stuck around 12 Brix, right? 12 Brix would be like 12% residual sugar. It'd be very sweet. Unless you're intending on making a sweet wine from that, that would be pretty risky. Anytime that there's any residual sugar left out and about and you don't address it immediately, either with like fortifying it with alcohol or sterile filtering it or putting sulfur dioxide in there to protect it, any type of other microorganism could come through and consume it and then produce off aromas in your wine, right? That's how spoilage occurs. So we don't want to do that. Okay, next we have pH. pH is a reflection of the chemical conditions of a solution, right? It's a logarithmic scale ranging from 1 being highly acidic to 14 being highly basic and 7 being neutral. This will ultimately determine the microbial activity, the overall health of the wine, right? So ultimately, we want the pH to be within a certain range for the style that we're making because we want to promote the function of the yeast that we want to thrive, the bacteria that we want to thrive, and also the enzymes and operations of all of those things that come into the picture as well, right? And overall, wines with a healthy pH on the lower side help preserve the wines during aging and keeps it from spoiling in general, right? Then we have an article on why pH is important, if you'd like to read more about that. And here we have a scale just for reference, just in case you need to see it again. So 7 is considered neutral on the pH scale. Anything less than 7 is considered acidic, and anything greater than 7 is considered alkaline or basic, right? Okay, and that brings us to titratable acidity, which is also commonly called total acidity in wine. So this is a measure of the sum of organic acids in a wine and their salts. Titratable acidity is so important because it's a reflection of the measurement of what the acids that we taste in a wine, So this contributes to the sourness and tartness. Wines with a low total acidity are actually considered flabby. That is the industry term for it, interestingly enough. And then wines with excessively high total acidity are considered very sour and tart, right? So there's two different ways to consider that. I also have an article linked from the Australian Wine Research Institute, AWRI. Great resource for winemaking, great resource for wine research, obviously. So definitely check that out if you'd like to learn more about that. And we're going to go over each of these components. When we have our labs, we'll have a lab specifically for Brix, pH, and TA, where we dive more into the chemistry, how we measure, and then applying it to the winemaking process in a hands-on way. All right, so this is just a little introduction. Okay, then we have lecture recap, also known as student learning objectives. So please refer to this to study for your quiz. Also, these review questions here are a great place to start as well. And then you should be ready for your quiz. So I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. But otherwise, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys next time.